An effective, cheap way of treating patients, or a waste of time and money. Homeopathy has often divided opinion.
Now the Department of Health is considering whether it should be put on a blacklist of treatments that GPs in England are banned from prescribing.
We're joined now by Michael Marshall from the Good Thinking Society, which has campaigned to stop the NHS funding of homeopathic treatments.
Also joined by Dr. Peter Fisher, a consultant rheumatologist at University College London Hospitals in our central London studio. Thank you both very much for joining us this morning. Michael, first of all, I mean, where do you stand? Where do you stand on this? Why not homeopathy?
Well, I mean, the evidence is very, very clear. I mean, the government has looked at this, the Australian government's looked at this, every credible expert has looked at this, and they've come to the conclusion that homeopathy simply doesn't work, and there's no real reason why it should work. If you look at what homeopathy is, and it's worth understanding what we're talking about, homeopathic remedies have got nothing at all in them. So there's no pollen in the homeopathic hay fever, there's no sulphur in the homeopathic sulphur. These are literally just sugar pills, so there's no reason why they would work. And yet it's a huge surprise then that the NHS spends £5 million a year funding these treatments. That's £5 million that could go to treatments that actually work, that actually help people, that could go to junior doctors, that could go to nurses. It's £5 million of wasted money. OK,
let's get the other side. Let's talk to Dr. Peter Fisher. Dr. Peter Fisher, you're a consultant rheumatologist. You regularly use homeopathy alongside conventional treatments, should I say. You've been hearing what we've been saying here in the studio. Your reaction?
Well, it does work. There's a considerable body of evidence that bears on this very question. In other words, if you integrate homeopathy in general practice, does it give you better outcomes? So there's studies including around 10,000 patients, mostly done in France and Germany, where a lot of GPs do use homeopathy, and it shows very clearly, they're unanimous. If you integrate homeopathy in general practice, you get better outcomes. Either you just get plain better outcomes, or you get the same outcome with less drugs. And we have a huge problem with over-prescribing of drugs. And incidentally, we're not talking about £5 million, we're talking about maybe £100,000 to be saved, potentially. But actually, you get better outcomes by integrating homeopathy, and the evidence says that net, it doesn't cost anything, it's cost neutral net.
Have you got figures to back that up? Because you sound, very convinced that this works, and you obviously use this treatment, yet the NHS is willing to put this on a blacklist, so...
Indeed, I do. So there are different questions. So the one is the question: what happens if you integrate homeopathy in general practice? And there are a number of studies of that, and they are unanimous that actually improves outcomes. The other question is about, do they have nothing in them? Actually, the majority of homeopathic medicines on sale in the high street pharmacies do contain, small amounts admittedly, but they do contain the substance that's on the label. And the question of whether it's a placebo effect or not, the most recent analysis was done by the Robertson Centre for Biostatistics at the University of Glasgow, and came to the clear conclusion that in clinical trials of homeopathy against placebo, homeopathy does better.
Well, we'll ask Michael Marshall about this. Now, I'm wary of getting involved in a tit-for-tat argument about the science, because it's something we can't establish here. I know you're shaking your head at some of the points there. If the point that Dr. Fisher is making is that when he is treating people, if he is of the firm belief that he sees better results, quicker results, that patients get well quicker by combining homeopathy, that's a good thing, isn't it? Even if you leave aside the argument whether the scientific tests show one thing or another, if that is his experience, why should he be stopped from using them?
Well, I think it shouldn't be a high bar to say that we have to show that something works before we can use it.
But he's saying he has the evidence in practice.
But the government's looked at the evidence, the Australian government's looked at the evidence, they've come to completely different conclusions. I mean, it's actually quite nonsensical to say that it's unanimous that the studies show homeopathy works. The conclusion's quite the opposite, really is. But this was an issue that was settled in 2010. The government has said since 2010 homeopathy doesn't work. The NHS says it doesn't work, and yet they're spending money on treatments that the NHS says doesn't work. If we were sat here talking about pharmaceutical or a different type of treatment that they were spending £5 million on, and they said it didn't work, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We would think it'd be absolutely ridiculous to fund that. That's where we really should be.
Dr. Peter Fisher, if this happens to go on this blacklist, how will that affect your relationship with your patients, the ones who are convinced and do believe that homeopathy works? How will that change the way you work?
Well, very negatively. They were patients who, it will affect, of course, the poorer patients, the ones who get free NHS prescriptions. Homeopathic medicines are relatively cheap, so, you know, if they were to buy it for themselves as opposed to get it on an NHS prescription, the difference would not be enormous, except for the people who are exempt from NHS charges, so that's retired people, people with chronic illnesses, children, and that would make a big difference to them.
OK, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning. Michael Marshall here in studio. Dr. Peter Fisher, thank you as well. Thank you both very much.
Going to bring you an update on children in need. We've been telling you that